When it comes crashing down and it hurts inside. Earlier today, at the age of 71, Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea passed away of what seemingly seems to be cardiac arrest, a heart attack. This news does come as a shock. It didn't seem like Hulk Hogan was in any bad health or had any illnesses recently. The last time we saw him publicly was on Raw back in the January 6th episode, the Netflix launch of Raw, where he was completely booed out of the building. So this video is completely unscripted. It's not going to be a biography of Hulk Hogan's career, going through each of his milestones, etc. It's just going to be kind of my initial thoughts to hearing the news, my reactions to it, and what I think overall about the life and legacy that Hulk Hogan is going to leave behind. First off, there is no doubt about it, this is a monumental day for the wrestling industry. There probably is nobody more popular, more well known to come out of wrestling than Hulk Hogan. He probably is more mainstream than John Cena, The Rock. If you pulled 100 people aside in the street, ask them to name one wrestler, 90 of them would probably say Hulk Hogan. He's the guy your parents knew, your grandparents knew. Everyone knew about this guy. And the impact he's had on the wrestling industry is undoubted. I've seen a tweet earlier from Dave Meltzer, which does ring true. Nobody in the history of wrestling has drawn more money, has had more people spend money or want to spend money to see them, and has led to a bigger growth to the industry than Hulk Hogan. So you could argue some of your favourite wrestlers you see today, even you being a fan, that might not be the case because of Hulk Hogan. And without him in the 1980s, with the rise of Hulkamania, and then the dip that wrestling had, and then the rise of the NWO in the 90s that brought it back to mainstream again, it's hard to say where the North American wrestling industry would be today. And it's hard to say if a lot of modern fans would be fans. You never know what knock-on effect Hulk Hogan not being in place would have had. Was he the greatest wrestler and in-ring technician? No. Nobody would rank Hulk Hogan up there as a great worker, shall we say. But in terms of his on-the-mic skills, his ability to sell a match, his ability to build hype, especially at the earlier stages. When I say earlier stages of his career, I probably mean like the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. There probably was nobody better than hooking people in and getting people to care than Hulk Hogan. Now, I'm not going to use this video to pour dirt on the legacy of a man who's just passed away. You know, his family is still in mourning. It's still fairly fresh, but you can't talk about the life and legacy of Hulk Hogan without looking at the dark side of things. Most infamously, Hulk Hogan was secretly filmed using a lot of racial slurs while he was having an affair with his then best friend, Bubba the Love Sponge's wife. That probably is the biggest stain on Hulk Hogan's legacy. A lot of fans turned off him at that point. The opinion was, if he's saying stuff like this in this one-off incident when he's filmed, who knows what he's saying other times when he hasn't been filmed, and what his opinions are of black people in general. It seemed like at the time he didn't approve of his daughter dating a black man, and that led to him using these racial slurs in a derogatory way, which of course is unacceptable. That real-life stuff, that actual day-to-day stuff that affects real people, is, in my opinion, the worst thing about Hulk Hogan's legacy and the message he's leaving behind. He tried to portray for years this goody two-shoes, eat your vitamins, say your prayers, you know, I'm fighting for every American, doesn't matter what colour, what race, what creed, we're all in this together. And that kind of flew in the face of that. We know he was a wrestling character, but it would have been nice for people, especially who grew up on Hulk Hogan, to kind of have that idea that the guy behind the character was actually like that, but it seems he wasn't. And a lot less importantly, there is a lot of stains on Hulk Hogan's name inside the wrestling industry. Hogan was notorious for holding down younger talent. He didn't want to work with younger talent. He'd refuse to do the job for younger talent. There's a catchphrase in the wrestling community of "that doesn't work for me, brother." That comes from Hulk Hogan. That comes from him essentially not wanting to lose, not wanting to compromise his position on the card to wrestlers he deemed not worthy of beating Hulk Hogan. I'm sure you've seen the memes where people will add Hogan to the end of a wrestler's name, like Becky Lynch with Becky Hogan recently, when it seems like they're going on a run of win after win after win and not putting over younger talent. That comes from Hulk Hogan. It seemed like he was just hell-bent on maintaining his place in the card at all costs and had no interest in kind of growing the wrestling industry and passing it off to the next generation. Probably most infamously, in my opinion, with Bret Hart. I think it was 1993 when Hart lost the title at WrestleMania and Hogan sweeps in to beat Yokozuna for the belt. And the agreement was Hogan and Bret would have a match and Bret would go over, and that would set up Bret as the next main guy in WWE. But Hogan didn't want to do it, and there's so many examples of that throughout his career. It just seemed like he was really selfish when it came to his brand, his image, and keeping himself relevant in the wrestling community. There's also other things, like Hogan was known for notoriously lying. He infamously said that he worked 400 days a year because there was time zone differences with him traveling to Japan and back to America, that was possible. He's exaggerated so many stats and statistics over his career about how much he worked, how often he worked, who he worked, how much money certain things earned, how popular something was, and just straight up coming up with outright, easily refutable blanket statements that anyone could just look up and discredit. So anything Hulk Hogan said, you could never take at face value. Toward the end of his career, you just have to assume that everything he said was lying. So all of this put together, in my opinion, will lead Hulk Hogan to going down as one of the most divisive figures in wrestling history. I think a lot of older fans who grew up with Hulk Hogan are willing to look past a lot of his misgivings and still hold him as this godly, wrestling figure that saved wrestling. But I think a lot of younger fans did see through the facade of what Hulk Hogan was trying to portray. I think we could all see that this was a selfish guy who was kind of just in it for the money. He was in it for himself. And he was willing to step on others and lie and exaggerate to get what he wanted. With all of this in mind though, I do think it is a bit harsh to rejoice and run for the hills and sing the praises that Hulk Hogan has passed. From a wrestling standpoint, he did have a lot of great moments. Like I said, the 80s with Hulkamania brought wrestling to heights it had never seen before, and probably is the reason it is as mainstream as it is today. And he did take a big risk in the 90s by turning heel with the NWO, which reinvigorated wrestling and probably has a more lasting influence than his 80s run, because the idea of a cool heel is still prevalent in wrestling and still mainstream throughout the whole world. Not saying Hogan was the first one to do it, but he did really popularize it. Where does this leave the memory of Hulk Hogan, in my opinion? Look, most of Hogan's run was over by the time I started watching wrestling. I started watching wrestling in 2004 and he was basically semi-retired at that point. He did have a few more years in WWE with sporadic matches, and then he did matches in stuff like TNA and his own promotion. But he was basically semi-retired, so all of his best work was before I started watching, and going back retroactively, I can appreciate the stuff he did in the 80s, the stuff he did in the 90s. Even his early 2000s run, there was a nice quirk to him coming back, and it was nice, you could tell it was nice for fans to see the guy they loved coming back and to see him in a good light. So for me, it's a mixed bag. I think it's a shame for wrestling history. It's a shame for Hulk Hogan as a person that he will not go down as a universally loved and revered man for what he did to the wrestling industry. Now he'll always have this asterisk next to his name of he did a lot of good things, but behind the scenes he was just an awful guy. I think you can see with a lot of modern guys that doesn't need to be the case. You look at John Cena. He's done a lot of good things for the wrestling industry, and then outside of the wrestling industry, he's a real nice guy, does a lot with the Make-A-Wish. It's clear that a lot of what Cena does is genuine. That's really who he is. Whereas unfortunately with Hulk Hogan, it seemed like a lot of the good stuff about him was an act put on for the character of Hulk Hogan. But I don't want to wrap this up in too negative of a way. I hope I've been fairly balanced. Look, it's a difficult topic to talk about. As with anything in life, there are shades of grey to everything. Was Hulk Hogan the character good for wrestling? Is wrestling better off for having the man, Terry Bollea, enter wrestling and go on the run he had? Yes. But was the man behind the character, was Terry Bollea, on a personal level, probably a bad guy who was very selfish, very racist, a compulsive liar who had very, very strange views about the world? Yeah, also true. So an interesting day in wrestling history. I'll be curious to see how WWE react to this. I think they will do a big memorial show. I know in recent months they've kind of strayed away from highlighting Hulk Hogan and featuring him in a prominent light. I think a lot of that comes down to his recent support for Donald Trump. And in America, a lot of WWE fans are anti-Trump. They're a lot more progressive than your traditional Trump supporters, so that turned a lot of the fans against him in recent memory. But I do think they'll put on an appropriate show, an appropriate tribute to the stuff that Hulk Hogan did in the wrestling world. As much as he divides fan opinions, it was never going to be a Chris Benoit type situation where he was universally hated for what he'd done and they basically washed him from the history books. That'll never happen with Hulk Hogan. Because even though what he did was terrible, it was abhorrent, it should be condemned, it'll never be put on the same level as what Chris Benoit did. So to sum it up, how am I going to look back on the life and the legacy of Hulk Hogan? I think I'll remember Hulk Hogan as a guy who saw an opportunity. He saw an industry that was beginning, it was on the verge of exploding, and he took advantage of that, and he carried that ball for many years, which brought it to the place of mainstream popularity that we all now love. And a lot of wrestlers grew up watching him. A lot of your favourite wrestlers probably wouldn't be in the industry without Hulk Hogan, so there's no doubt he did a lot of good there. But on the other hand, you can't forget what the guy was like outside of the ring, his opinions and the way he viewed the world. I think that's the important lesson there. Get all sides of every story you can, have a nuanced opinion. It doesn't have to be black and white, and put some thought and effort into the good side of a situation, but also condemn, learn from, and don't make the same mistakes from the bad side of a situation. So how did you react to the passing of Hulk Hogan? Let me know your favourite Hulk Hogan moment down in the comments, because someone's father, someone's loved one did pass away. They're innocent in all of this, so it shouldn't just be a complete berate fest. Let's spread some positivity into the world. Let me know your favourite Hulk Hogan moments. For the record, mine probably is that kind of 2002 to 2004 run, just slightly before I started watching, but I loved him winning the tag titles with Edge. The Mr. America stuff was kind of funny, and he had some interesting matchups, you know, Hogan against Brock Lesnar, against Kurt Angle. It's just a weird clashing of eras. He won the title at one point, took that bad chokeslam from Undertaker, and to me that was the most interesting Hulk Hogan, but I know that it'll probably be in the minority and a lot of people will prefer his 80s stuff and of course his stuff in the NWO. Thanks so much for watching, have a good day, and as always I'll see you on the next one.